Earthquake. What do you guys understand about an earthquake? Why do you think it occurs?
Collision of tectonic plates.
Okay. What about tectonic plates? What is a tectonic plate?
It's like a core inside an earth.
I 1 second. Want everyone to answer. Okay, I'm not teaching one person, and since the screen does not really, I cannot do a chat window plus this simultaneously. You'll have to unmute yourselves and speak. Okay, either you speak or I'll randomly call out names and I'll ask you guys your opinion. Okay, for now, Yatish, you can continue. You
It's like
explaining what a tectonic plate was. Yeah.
yes, it's like a piece of a kind of a crust inside Earth. If there is a collision between those two plates,
Okay.
there will be a moment of earth above or below that causes
No.
either a volcanic eruption or ground vibration.
Okay. Who else is there? Aditya.
Sir, the earthquake is generally like inner vibrations of motion, sir, within the Earth's crust.
Okay. Other than this tectonic plate reason, can there be any other reason for an earthquake?
Yes, sir, it could be due to any tidal vibrations in oceans, due to tidal increase in tides and
Okay.
temperature increase.
Okay. Next,
Due to that
Shubham is
also it
there.
can.
Shubham is there. Not there. Nitish.
Yes, sir, I'm there.
Okay. Can you think of a man-made reason as to why an earthquake can occur?
Nuclear bombs. Any dropping
Okay.
of testing of any bombs.
Okay.
Sir,
Any
mining.
mining?
Mining.
Correct. Okay. What else? In fact, very recently, I mean not very recently, about 40 to 50 years ago, there was, a man-made earthquake that occurred in India. Does anyone know where and what the reason was? No one. So what had happened was, the irrigation department decided to build a dam across the Koyna River, and Koyna Dam was formed. Okay. So when they decided the spot or the location for the dam, they had not done the geological survey properly. Okay, they not assessed the ground properties there, and the dam was constructed, and obviously the water started getting stored in the reservoir area. Okay, and over a period of time, this amount or volume of water kept increasing, and this water will eventually exert an overburden pressure on the ground underneath. Correct. So what people didn't know was there was a hidden fault underneath this area. Okay, and because of this massive water pressure from top, that fault actually slipped and an earthquake was caused. So that was one of the I don't know, key turning points where ground penetration radars and the other tests started being performed before you actually started constructing heavy infrastructure projects. So the reasons for earthquake, like you guys mentioned, can either be natural or man-made, say due to a nuclear explosion or something like this, due to mining, where you've dug too deep and you've not, stabilized it through proper means. So something can happen. Okay. How many of you here have studied engineering geology in your, undergraduate course? Did all of you all study geology?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Some
Sir.
people might not have studied, like for example, Aditya studied in RV college. We did not have a geology course. So for some of
Yeah.
you all, some of this PPT might be a repetition course where we're talking about types of faults and all that. Okay. For the others, it will be a new topic. Pay attention. It is mostly theory. We'll quickly run through. If you have doubts, you can unmute yourself and ask questions. Okay. So like everything else in the world, it all started with the Big Bang. Okay. So you guys know what the Big Bang theory is. They says that there was one giant explosion. Okay, say about 15 billion years ago, and back then nothing that we know today existed. There were no planets, moon, stars, whatever. There was just a huge gaseous mass exploding and traversing across the universe in all the directions. Eventually what happened, the denser material started coming together, okay, to form suns and moons and planets. okay, from these gases and other heavy metals. So things started condensing. Okay, even now, if you look at any solar system, there's one center of a solar system, and things are surrounding it. So it's sort of the way the entire universe works as well. Okay, so you had something called as protoplanets and then the planets. So if you look at the image on the right, it is sort of a pictorial representation of how things proceeded. First, there was a giant mass condensation, further condensation, and then there's a sun in between, and then the different planets. Okay, so the Earth, as we know, was also formed in a similar process. And during the process of formation of Earth, obviously the Earth started segregating or started forming in different layers. Okay, does anyone know what the different layers of Earth are?
Crust, mantle, outer crust, inner crust, core.
Correct. So there's mainly the three different regions. There is crust, there is mantle, and there is core. Is crust solid or in a molten form?
Molten.
Crust.
Core in molten form.
Crust is basically what we are standing on right now. It is the outermost layer. Okay, it is solid. I mean, there can be water over it, but crust itself is solid. Okay. Below crust, what do we have?
Mantle,
Mantle. Okay, is mantle solid or in molten form?
molten.
Actually, mantle is technically solid, but it can deform in a plastic form. Okay. What about core? Is
Molten
core
state.
molten or solid?
Molten.
Okay, there are two things here. Core only, there are two parts. There is something called as an outer core and an inner core. Outer core is molten. Okay, it is constantly swirling and moving around. But the inner core, due to the very high pressure, is actually solid. Okay, so first inner core is solid. Around that you have the outer core, which is molten, and then you have mantle, which is solid but can deform plastically, and then you have the crust. Okay, so this is how it looks. Correct? So possible quiz questions. What is the depth of a typical continental crust? So on and so forth. I'll share this with you guys, but I'll also suggest you take down notes when the class is going on. Okay. So crust, mantle, outer core, inner core. Next. So this we've already discussed anyway, but talking about the chemical composition. So the core is mostly made of iron and nickel. Okay, ferrous materials, and with also about 10% sulfur in it. Okay, and like I said, the inner core is under extreme pressure, so it will always remain solid, and this molten outer core is sort of moving around it. Okay, and this magnetic field that we know of the Earth is mostly because of this presence of these ferrous materials. Okay, next, there is mantle, and next question would be these earthquakes that we know of. Okay, at what layer of this earth do they generate?
Lithosphere.
Correct. But out of these three layers, I'm talking about core, mantle, and core. I mean crust. Out of these three layers, in which layer does an earthquake normally generate?
Core.
Mantle.
Actually, it does not ever go as deep as the core. Okay. So it is always in the crust, but sometimes it might be in the mantle if it is a very deep earthquake. Okay. So most of the earthquakes that you see is actually due to whatever is happening in the crust itself. Okay. Do you guys know of discontinuities? Have you heard of discontinuity? Anyone? If anyone has studied CBSE, ICSE, you might have heard of things like Mohorovic discontinuity and Gutenberg discontinuity. Has anyone heard? No one? Okay. Take this as homework, okay, and find out what the different discontinuities between the different layers are. Okay, possible quiz question again. Okay, now coming on to the main reason why we have earthquakes. Like Yatish's first point when he said why earthquakes occur was tectonic plates. Okay, so in 1915, the scientist called Alfred Wegener suggested that initially when the Earth was formed, the continents did not exist as we know today. Okay, it was one giant landmass called Pangea. Okay, and then it split up into two things, and then eventually they split up into more parts, and they started drifting away from each other together, and the world as we know today sort of came into picture. So we might have a small GIF to show you how it. 1 second. So can you see this? So initially the world was like this, okay, and then it fractured and then started moving apart and further apart. If you notice, India is here, correct? Initially, notice India was actually attached to the southern tip of Africa, and parts of even Australia and Antarctica as we know today. Okay, look at this. India is in what color?
Red.
Yeah. So what has happened is the entire Indian subcontinental plate sort of went and rammed into the Asian plate that where China exists today. Okay, and at the contact, area between this Asian plate and the Indian subcontinental plate is where we have Himalayas today. Okay. In fact, if you guys have heard of reports, they say Himalayas grows by certain number of centimeters every year. That is because this push that is happening towards the Asian plate is a continuous process, and the Indian plate is sort of moving over the Asian plate, and that is why the height of the mountain rises every year. Okay. Now this theory, do you think there is proof for this theory that he suggested that something like this happened, or what was the reason he suggested? Okay. So if you look at this GIF also, look at what happens between South America and Africa. They sort of sit together like a puzzle piece, correct? So if you actually had to, I'll just make a note of this. We'll come back to this again. So look at this. Okay, they literally sit together. It's like they were part of one thing together, and then they eventually split and drifted apart. Okay, so matching coastlines is one evidence that your continental drift theory was true. Okay, the second reason is your matching mountain ranges. Okay, so before these things split, mountains existed in that region. Okay, they were made of a similar rock type. They probably had similar glacial deposits. Okay, soil type, and eventually when they split and drifted apart, the mountains still existed, and the materials have been made of since they're common. You can make sure that these things were probably together. Okay, next, like I said, matching types of rocks, soils, and their ages. So if you look at this region again, the entire southern part of India, the southern part of Africa, southern part of South America, the entire Australia, and what you know as Antarctica today was all part of one thing. So if you actually dig deep down, the sort of soil strata that can be obtained or the type of rocks that is there is also common. And if you do the carbon dating and see their ages, they're all the same. This is further evidence that initially everything was one giant piece of land. So same image again from the previous thing. If all these things that are highlighted are put together, it will look something like this. Okay, and they have similar glacial deposits. Next, this we'll roughly skip through. This is just point wise. Now, if you look at this, can you look at the Indian plate there? What happened? Okay, the Indian plate there. Okay, so some textbooks, what they prefer to do is they also call it the Indo-Australian plate and show it as a giant, plate together. So it is fine. And one thing to notice here is even amongst this large plates that you see, there might be further, smaller fractions of it. Okay. So it is not that this one giant plate is one continuous tectonic plate without any breaks or fractures in between is not true. This is just like an overgeneralization of, just to distribute the major land masses. There can be further divisions amongst these major plates themselves. Okay. Now talking about the contact surfaces between these plate boundaries, like for example here between the Indian plate and the Australian plate, at this junction, okay, what is the sort of junction that exists? So based on the type, based on the nature or based on how these two tectonic plates meet, we sort of classify the region between two tectonic plates as convergent, divergent, and transform. Okay, when we say divergent, what has happened is two tectonic plates move away from each other and they make new land. Okay, when we say convergent, one landmass or one tectonic plate is coming and crashing over the other and moving above it. Convergent, in this case the land is being consumed. Okay, so some land is going underneath the other, correct? So in the previous case, new land was formed between those two plates. In the second case, land is being consumed. Whereas in the last case, in the transform type plate boundaries, land is neither consumed, or nor created, because nothing is going above other or away from each other. They're just sliding past each other or shearing past each other. Okay, so no new areas created or destroyed. They just simply slide past each other. So again, a pictorial, example of the different types of plate boundaries. Now, depending on the nature of the edge of these plate boundaries, they can be further classified as land, or water, land. Okay. So, for example, here, if you see this convergent, there is land on this side and there is water on this side. So, this can be an oceanic and land convergent. Or it can be something like in case of India and China, where there was both land, and at the junction between India and China, Himalayas was created. Okay, so that is land convergent. So the various permutations and combinations you can think of. Okay, so whatever I said again, just simply listed again. So in divergent, plates move away from each other, new land is created. Normally, the types of faults that you can observe is a normal fault. And in such cases, like Aditya had mentioned, or someone had mentioned, volcanoes can occur. Okay, it can make way for volcanoes, and it doesn't. That in terms of energy release, it is not very explosive. Okay. Next, convergent plate boundaries. The plate move towards each other. The land is consumed. The type of faults that you observe here is reverse or thrust fault. And like in case of Himalayas again, since one land is moving above the other, mountains or hills can be formed at the junction between the two plates. Okay, and in terms of the energy released as compared to divergent, it is huge. Okay, normally it results in volcanic explosions. Okay, next, again, like I said, there is ocean on one side, land on one side, ocean land margin. Similarly, you can have a ocean, okay, where everything is happening under the ground and not visible to the naked eye. So it's basically underwater. Next, you have continent, example, the Himalayas. Next, you have your transform. So if you notice here, look at this ridge here, okay, and look at this ridge here. So this ridge and this ridge was initially basically along the same line. Okay, and then eventually what has happened, they've slid past each other. So nothing is moving above each other, they're just sliding past each other. Next, why do these tectonic plate movements actually occur? Okay, so the key reason here is this temperature difference. Can you see? Okay, the core is very hot and the surface of the earth is what, 27-28 degrees Celsius on an average. Okay, so this huge temperature difference between the core and the surface, eventually, because of law of thermodynamics, there has to be some stability, and there has to be this heat dissipation that should happen somehow. Okay, and this rising and falling of mantles, okay, and moving of tectonic plates is this heat dissipation mechanism that is there. When you think of a pot of water, when you keep it on stove for boiling, you know how convection works, right? Things get heated up, they move to the top, and the cooler things, they move down, and it's eventually a cycle. Think of something like that, but instead of water, it is happening in terms of the rocks and soil and molten materials. Okay, so because of this temperature difference, all these things, it's sort of move. Okay, but this is again not the only reason. It can be due to high pressure, or like Aditya said, tidal reasons, tidal movement. Next, okay, the two theories that you need to know about. One is called as the elastic rebound theory. So I'll not read this. I'll just show in figure and I'll explain with the help of that. So think of this as the initial condition. Okay, let this A and B initially be together one solid block of land mass. Okay, eventually what happens when things are sliding past each other, there is a little bit of plastic deformation that exists. I skipped a step. So it is like this. Okay, so initially it's one straight line. Plastic deformation exists, but beyond a certain point, okay, when the shearing cannot continue any further, at that point there's a fracture. Okay, there's a rupture, and eventually things will become like this. Okay. Now, if you notice the difference between this region to this region, there is some horizontal distance that is there between these 2 points. Okay, this horizontal distance between the before and after fractured regions is what is called as a slip. Okay, slip, remember. Okay, and the point of origin of this earthquake is called the focus. Okay, and the vertical projection of this focus on the surface of the earth is called epicenter. Normally, people mistake epicenter to be the point of origin of the earthquake. Okay, but epicenter is not the point of origin of the earthquake. The focus is the point of origin of the earthquake. Epicenter is simply the vertical projection of this focus on the earth. You know, they say the epicenter of the earthquake is located 50 kilometers from Tokyo. Okay, it means somewhere deep below that point is where the focus was. Okay, the earthquake originated there. It's just that when projected vertically upwards onto the surface, it happened to be 50 kilometers from Tokyo. Okay, so this key difference between focus and epicenter you need to understand. Okay, don't get confused. So, like I said, that is the amount of slip. Okay, so the slip is important because when we talk about magnitude of an earthquake, if you've seen all these news channels, they say an earthquake of Richter scale magnitude 7, Richter scale magnitude 8. All these numbers that are there, is actually a function of this ground displacement. Okay, initially it was a direct function of logarithmic function of ground displacement. But people have, over time realized the method of calculating magnitudes simply using ground amplitude is actually wrong. So these days we have something called as C-swing moment magnitude, which is more accurate. And in that, the slip that is there is a parameter that is used to find out the magnitude. So just keep slip in mind. We'll come back to this when we start solving problems. Next. Okay, next again, what are the different parts of fault? Okay, so a fault is basically something that exists between two tectonic plates, or maybe in a single tectonic plate as well, between two fractions. Okay, and if you take this fault and you bring it to the surface, okay, it's called the surface trace of the fault. This is important. In fact, this is quite clearly visible. And then there is something called as a blind fault. Blind fault andre, a fault exists between two tectonic plates. Okay, but this fault does not reach the surface of the earth, so it cannot really be traced. Okay, maybe what happened with the Koyna Dam was something like this. There was a fault there underneath, but unfortunately there was no surface trace of it. So people did not realize there was a fault that existed. Okay, and in any fault, what happens is there is one tectonic plate that goes below and one tectonic plate that moves above, correct? So whatever moves below is called the footwall. Okay, and whatever moves above is called the hanging wall. Now, depending on the position between the footwall and the hanging wall, you can further classify these faults as normal fault, reverse fault, and displacement fault. Okay, in the normal fault, your hanging wall is here and your marker or your bed wall is there, and in the reverse fault it is the opposite. I might have images for this, I'll show you later. And in your transverse wall, transverse displacement, what happens is nothing is moving past each other. So there is no concept of hanging wall at all. They just slide past each other. Okay. So if they ask you for types of faults, normal fault, reverse fault, and displacement or transverse fault. There is one more type of fault called oblique fault, which is a mixture of either normal and reverse and displacement together. Meaning they not only move vertically up and down, but also move sideways. Just 1 second. I just check if I have the image for that. The system has. Okay, can you see this image? What has happened? Okay, so in normal fault, one area of the land mass is basically risen with respect to the other. Okay, so this is an example for a normal fault. Okay, look at this. So this fracture, eventually this rock mass and this rock mass was basically in one line. Okay, and then what has happened when some earthquake has occurred, this thing has moved past this and caused a reverse fault. Next, this is an irrigation land. This is for the transverse type of fault. You can clearly see initially this was one straight line. Okay, when the earthquake has occurred, what has happened? They've slid past each other. Okay, this is a strike slip or a transverse fault. Next. Again, this transverse faults, depending on if your left side is moving or your right side is moving, or the more ideal way of looking at it is this direction of motion. If it is clockwise or anti-clockwise. If it is, what direction is this? Okay, this will be left lateral or it can be right lateral. Next. Okay, this is the oblique slip fault that I was talking about. Okay, they not only move, vertically with respect to each other, but also move horizontally with respect to each other. So that is both either a normal fault and a strike slip fault, or a reverse fault and a strike slip fault. So there would be both horizontal and vertical together. Okay, so here again, see this is a fault with a surface trace. This is also a fault which does not have a surface trace. Okay, these are the things that we need to be careful about. Next, when an earthquake occurs, what is a series of events that actually happen? So first there is a fault, and then there is due to this tectonic plate movement at these faults, huge amount of energy is released, and because of this the earthquake is caused. Okay, and once this earthquake is caused, this energy that is being released obviously gets transferred from one point to another in the form of seismic waves. Okay, there are 4 different types of waves. We'll come to that in a little while. And once these waves strikes these positions on the earth, ground shaking occurs. Once the ground shaking occurs, the shaking or the acceleration is transferred from the ground to the structure, and the structure eventually fails. Okay, so this is basically the order in which it occurs. From the focus, energy release in form of waves cause ground motion cause structures to fail. So this is the surface trace of San Andreas fault. Okay, and this is the picture for the Indian subcontinental plate coming crushing the Asian plate near China, and that has led to the development of Himalayas. Next, this is another image of whatever it explained earlier. Focus, the point of origin of earthquake. Vertical projection of that on the surface is called epicenter. Some of the slides is repeated because I was trying to merge 2 PPTs. So I'll skip through all this because we've done this already. This is another, pictorial representation for elastic rebound theory. Initially, the fence was straight. The land started deforming. The fence also deformed with it. And eventually, once it broke apart, from plastic state, it went back to being solid again. And this is the amount of slip that is there. Okay, this is important. Foreshocks and aftershocks. So before a major earthquake occurs, there might be these tiny shock waves that are generated. Okay, so these shock waves that are generated before an earthquake occurs is called a foreshock. In fact, you might have read reports that animals such as dogs and a lot of birds actually can sense an earthquake even before it has occurred. Okay, so this is actually the reason. So these tiny shock waves that are generated, are of certain frequency, and these frequencies are, the most animals and birds are actually sensitive to these frequencies. So these foreshocks are felt and they sort of predict the arrival of an earthquake. Okay. And aftershocks are what happened after the earthquake has come and gone. So an earthquake has come, it has shook everything and gone. But since things have not reached a stable state, they might still continue to adjust and move slightly so that they reach a stable position. And this is an aftershock. And this aftershock is sort of happens also due to a lot of human activities. So an earthquake has come and gone. The land is obviously scattered and there's a lot of disturbance, and humans obviously will have to construct over it or move over it, and this also causes the tectonic plates to, or the region to move further. Okay, and these cause tiny aftershocks. Next, I'll come to body waves and surface waves with a better picture. For now, just understand earthquake origins at the focus, and this energy is dissipated in the form of waves and strikes the structure. Okay. Another figure of focus and the epicenter and the surface trace of the fault. Next, do you guys know what this is called? We've used it for dynamics also. There's a time history data of different earthquakes. Okay, so your x-axis will be time and the y-axis will be acceleration, or it can also be ground displacement. But if you look at the units, you can tell what it is. Here it says 0.5 g. So in this case, it was actually acceleration. Okay, so when an earthquake actually occurs, I think I told this when we did dynamics also. It is actually more helpful to measure the acceleration that is experienced by the ground than actually measure the displacement. Okay, because displacement will always be a function of the type of rock that is there. So it will always be relative displacement. You mount your accelerometer on a solid rock, will give a different reading as compared to your taking a reading from something on a soil or something in the middle of a lake. Okay, so that is why most of the accelerometers that are mounted, the way they mounted is you dig deep into the earth, say at least a few meters, find the hard rock strata where there is solid rock, construct a concrete bed over it, and then place the accelerometer on that. No accelerometer is ever placed at the ground level on soil. It is always on hard rock strata. Okay, so this is just the frequency of occurrence of an earthquake. So look at this. Very minor earthquakes are plenty. In fact, of magnitudes less than 3, it's about 1,000 per day. Okay, of magnitudes between 1 and 2, it's 8,000 earthquakes per day. So they don't really cause any major damage. But as the magnitude of the earthquakes keeps increasing, the possibility of it occurring reduces. Like, see, the possible number of earthquake of a magnitude greater than 8 per year is just 1. Okay, whereas between 7 and 7.9 is 18. So if you actually drew a graph for this, it's a perfectly logarithmic curve. Okay, and you guys must have heard of things like ISO heights and all that. ISO heights are lines that join points of equal rainfall. Okay. Similarly, you also have something called as isoseismal maps. So isoseismal maps are basically maps that show you contours of region that have the same magnitude earthquakes or same magnitude, the possibility of same magnitude earthquake that is can be generated there. Okay. Or conversely, it can also be the intensity of earthquake that can be felt due to an earthquake that has occurred at that point. Do you guys know the difference between magnitude and intensity? Anyone? So see this figure, for example, is an example for intensity. Okay, so there is a 100-watt bulb. If you set it, okay, the farther you move away from it, the lesser is the light that reaches you, or lesser is the intensity. Okay, so an intensity works this way. Suppose an earthquake has occurred in Mysore. Okay, in places region closer to Mysore, say Mandya, or on the other side you have Nanjangud, the effect that is felt due to the earthquake is more. Okay, whereas you move farther away and come to say Bangalore, it would have faced lesser intensity as compared to say Mandya. Okay, you go farther away, you go to say Kolar, it is much lesser. Okay, so intensity can differ for the same earthquake depending on where you're measuring the intensity. Okay, and also I must say you can't really measure intensity. It is only, it can how do I say this, you can only gauge it based on the sort of destruction it has done, or the sort of effects it has had. Okay, or based on how people felt it was. So intensity does not have a mathematical equation where you can substitute parameters and calculate. It is purely a relative and subjective term. Okay, and for the same earthquake that has occurred, the intensity can differ based on where you measure, where you are, taking this survey that you're doing. Whereas magnitude is not. Magnitude of an earthquake will remain the same irrespective of wherever you measure it. Okay, an earthquake is occurred in Mysore. You place an accelerometer in Bangalore, in Kolar, in Tumkur, in Nanjangud, wherever you want. The magnitude, when you measure it using the mathematical formula, will be the same. If you get 8 here, it will be 8 there, because that is how the formula has been designed. We'll come to the formula in a little while, but just understand magnitude constant for an earthquake irrespective of wherever you measure it. Okay, intensity differs for the same earthquake depending on where you are. Next, so this is all positions of all the earthquakes that have occurred in the past. My system is today. Okay. So Bhuj earthquake 2001, the most devastating earthquake we've had in recent times. So for your minor project, if you've referred 1893, you would have seen the seismic zone map. Okay, and the key thing to be noticed there is the zones that is divided into starts from zone 2. There is no zone 1 at all. Okay, you might have asked yourself, why is there no zone 1? Why does it start directly from zone 2? So what happened is before the Bhuj earthquake, this map on the left was actually the map. Okay, and then after that, what happened? People decided, zone 1 is, let's move everything that was there in zone 1 to zone 2, and some regions that was there in zone 2 to zone 3, from zone 3 to zone 4, from zone 4 to zone 5. So that it is designed for at least some amount of seismic load. Okay, earlier, if it was in zone 1, we considered it to be safe and we didn't do any sort of design for it. Okay, but now since it is at least zone 2, we consider a certain amount of acceleration. That's the possibility. We do basic calculation and then design the building for that. So a little bit of history here. So if they ask you why there is no zone 1, you need to tell there was zone 1, but after the Bhuj earthquake, people decided that there needs to be some minimal design at least, so everything in zone 1 was moved to zone 2. Next, this measure of earthquake, like I said, does anyone know what this thing is or how this thing works? Have I shown this to you guys before?
No, sir.
Okay.
No, sir.
So what happens is there is one big golden pot in between. Okay. And there are dragons coming out of this golden pot in all directions. And in the mouth of these dragons, there is a small golden ball. Okay. And that golden ball is fixed there. And vertically underneath this dragon's mouth, you have a frog with its mouth open. Okay. So how they used to measure an earthquake or the possibility or when an earthquake strikes is, if an earthquake come and struck, okay, in the direction which the earthquake has occurred, the golden ball from the dragon's mouth would slip and fall into the frog's mouth. Okay, so this was a very rudimentary method of measuring an earthquake, and in which direction the earthquake actually occurred. This is one of the earliest recorded devices that sort of gave proof of an occurrence of an earthquake. And thankfully, now we have more scientific methods. We don't have to rely on dragons and frogs. Okay, so I'll explain how a modern seismogram works with the help of a figure itself. Let's skip the theory. 1 second. Okay, so this was an early seismograph. So what used to happen was there was a rotating drum and a paper was fixed on the rotating drum. Okay, vertically they would hang a pendulum with a pen or a pencil attached or some inking device attached to the bottom of it. Okay, and to make sure this pendulum does not sway however it wants, whenever it wants, they would they would place a magnet around it. Okay, and this magnet would create a magnetic field to ensure that that string that is carrying the pendulum bob and pen remains vertically erect all the time, until an earthquake strikes it. Okay, and when an earthquake occurs, your drum with the paper starts rotating and your pen starts moving, and that is how it used to record the ground motion. Okay, these days you have something a little more sophisticated. Like see here, if, for example, I told you it is always placed on a bedrock. Okay, deep down on a bedrock, you place it. So similar thing again. You have a pendulum that is attached to a rigid structure using a very high stiffness thing, and then you have a rotating drum and a pen and paper. One more thing you need to understand is you also do this when you're doing ETAPS, right? You have to define earthquake force for X direction separately, Y direction separately, so on and so forth. So all these accelerometers that we have can actually measure the acceleration only in one direction at a time. So at any given point, you need to have at least 3 accelerometers to measure the earthquake. Its component along x-axis, its component along y-axis, and in this case, if you look at the figure, this is for the z-axis. Vertically, what was the ground motion that was observed? Next. Okay, so this is a typical seismograph. Okay, so if you take any seismograph anywhere in the world, any earthquake data, initially it is flat. Okay, there is no background noise, there's no ground motion, nothing, and then suddenly a tiny jolt is felt. Okay, this jolt of first wave that arrives is called the P wave. Okay, or the P also stands there for primary wave. Okay, once the primary wave has come and gone, the second wave hits. What do you think the S here stands for?
Secondary.
Correct. Little bit of background story here. When I was learning earthquake during my UG days, I said the exact same answer. I assumed P was primary, so S must be secondary. But unfortunately, S is not actually secondary. Okay, S stands for shear. Okay, so this S here is for a shear wave because the propagation of this wave happens through shear transfer. Just remember this. Okay, and once the S wave has come and gone, you have the surface waves. So P wave and S wave together are classified under something called as body waves. Okay, I'll just go to that table 1 second. Remind me, I'll explain the body wave and surface wave again. Between, I don't know, some slide order has changed. We'll finish off whatever is here. Okay. So classification of earthquake based on the depth of its occurrence. Okay. So shallow earthquakes less than 70 kilometers. Intermediate earthquakes 70 to 300, and anything greater than 700 is deep. So I mean anything between 300 and 700 is deep, and most of the earthquakes occur within 700. No earthquakes occur beyond 700. The reason for this is, like I said, once a mantle starts, there is a sort of plastic deformation that occurs. Okay, and they might not actually be fracturing and energy releasing the way we understand it in crust. Okay, next. This I've already explained. Strange animal behavior, foreshocks is done. Change in water level. What happens is when an earthquake occurs, due to the vibration, sometimes the porosity or the voids that is present between the soil sort of vanishes and they become compacted. Okay, And in case it is a region where there is a water table close by or there's a lake nearby, you can observe the changes in the water level, okay, due to this. So that is one thing. Yeah. Coming to seismic waves. So we have two main types in which the earthquake waves are classified. First is the body wave, and then there's a surface wave. When we talk about body wave, they basically start from your focus itself. Your focus is very deep within the earth where the earthquake originated, correct? From there itself, your P wave and S wave will start moving towards in all directions. Okay, whereas surface waves gets transmitted only on the surface. You can sort of call it starts from the epicenter and moves along in all directions. Okay, so how each of them work, I'll explain with the help of a figure. Okay, so primary waves, they sort of move through compression and elongation. Have you guys seen an earthworm move? Okay, and earthworm does not move like a snake. So it basically contracts and expands, contracts and expands. So think of P wave like an earthworm. That is how the P waves move. So it's contraction and expansion. And P waves can travel through solids, liquids, or gases. Okay, and this material movement is same in all direction. And okay, this is the first thing to arrive when an earthquake strikes. Now, if you look at this figure here, okay, when this thing is passing through a single region, right, it passes. But when it is passing from one layer to another layer, sort of refraction happens. Okay, and when it passes from, say, this outer core to the mantle again, there is refraction again. So based on this refraction, there is a region of this earth, okay, that is a shadow zone where P waves are not felt at all. Okay, so just remember this. Three key things to remember. What P waves happen through compression and elongation. So it is the first wave to arrive when an earthquake strikes. It can travel through all three, that is solid, liquid, and gas. Okay, so it looks something like this. Notice that black box that has been highlighted. Initially, it is a normal square. Okay, but as the earthquake comes, it gets compressed and then it elongates and then it goes back to normal. Okay, so this is how a P wave works. Okay, in comparison to this is how an S wave works. Okay, now forget the earthworm, come back to a snake. How does a snake travel? Similar to this. Okay, there is shearing action. Okay, that is why it is called an S wave. Now, key thing to remember here is liquid capable of taking shear? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
No, sir.
See, how can liquid take shear? I mean, take your hand, when you're in a swimming pool, take your hand, put it on water. Does the water prevent your hand from going, the surface prevent your hand from going into water? No. Okay. So shear waves cannot travel through liquids. Okay. So because of that, in compared to the previous figure, if you look at the figure here, so through the mantle, there is no issue. Okay. Your secondary wave simply transfer. As soon as it touches the outer core, I told you outer core is in what form? Molten form. Okay. And anything that is molten or liquid does not, what do you call it? Okay, tappide. Adu secondary wave and shear wave ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. What did I say? Yeah, liquids cannot take shear action. Okay, so your S waves do not travel through your outer core at all, and because of that, the shadow region that is there for your S waves is actually huge. If you compare this to the shadow region of your P wave, it is P wave is actually less. Okay, compare this to the shadow region of your S wave, it is huge. Okay, so things to remember for secondary, shear wave is what? It is a second wave to arrive. Okay, it can only travel through solids, and the transfer is through shearing action, like in an S-shaped curve. Okay, and because of this, since it cannot travel through liquids and fluids, and it's the molten liquid outer core, this is a huge shadow region. Okay, next type. This is again a better representation of the shadow region that I was talking about. So P waves are in black, S waves are in what color is that? Red. Okay. So look at the region. So this entire thing, there is no S wave at all. Okay. So if I place an accelerometer on the opposite side of wherever the earthquake epicenter was, my earthquake data will not show any S wave in the reading at all. They'll only be P waves. Next, yeah, this is the discontinuity I was talking about. It's not really important to you, but it's general knowledge. Go home and study a little about Mohorovic and Gutenberg discontinuity. Okay, next, surface waves. So this energy, once it reaches the epicenter, from there, surface wave starts propagating. And if you look at that initial graph that was there for the entire earthquake data, look at the amplitude of measurement for P wave and S wave is less. Okay, whereas for surface wave it is huge. So most of the damage that is done to all the civil engineering structures is actually due to this high magnitude of surface waves. Okay, so so surface waves, again, two kinds. You have something called as the Love wave and the Rayleigh wave. Okay, so I'll show this and then come back to explaining it. See how a Rayleigh wave works. Okay, it's like an oblique thing. So the effect is more towards the surface and it is less underground. Understanding? So the square that was there, in both the previous cases, the square would become a rectangle and come back to being a square. But in this case, if you notice, the square at some point becomes a trapezoid. The bottom is less, the top becomes more. Okay, and that's how the disturbance is. And coming to the last type of wave, the Love wave, this is how it is. Okay, what is the difference between your Love wave and your S wave now? Should I go back to that and show you guys that again? It'd be a little confusing because both move like snake, but there is one key difference. Look at the direction of motion here. Okay, your shearing action is happening vertically. That vertical shearing basically keeps transferring equally from one end to another end. Whereas in case of a Love waves, that is not the case. Okay. Again, on the top, the magnitude of ground motion is more. At the bottom, the magnitude of ground motion is less. Okay, indicated by these arrow marks on the side. Can you see? On top, there's a huge difference. At bottom, it is relatively small. So this is how Love waves and Rayleigh waves propagate, and most of the destruction that you see is due to the Love waves and Rayleigh waves. So if you look at that road, for example, in that image, initially it was one straight line, and now it is being broken up into multiple pieces, and they just disturbed. Okay. So again, one more analogy for your P waves is your spring. Okay, how for it to propagate like an earthworm. Okay, your shear wave, a snake, or a rope with something attached to its end. Okay, like I said again, typical what do you call it? Time history data. So you will be given something like this in the exam. Right? So exam only they'll give you a graph like this with all the values, and they'll tell you to find out position of an epicenter. Okay, can you do that? I'll not tell you how. Just by looking at this graph, can you tell me where the epicenter of an earthquake is located? And if yes, how? Anyone? It's actually, I know, simple mathematics. See, any earthquake will have both P wave and S wave. Okay, so P wave will arrive first and S wave will come after that. and there is always certain time interval between the arrival of P wave and S wave, correct? So if there is some way we could calculate the velocity of P wave and the velocity of S wave, okay, and using the time difference between them, we can actually find out at what distance the epicenter is located from the point of measurement. Okay, but the only key thing to remember here is it sort of works like a triangulation. If I get the epicenter distance from my point, I can draw a circle around me. So my epicenter can be, at the end of the circle in any direction. Okay, so what do you need? You need 3 circles, something like this. Right? So say at the center of this one, I found out that my epicenter is at a distance of 100 kilometers. I'll draw a circle of radius 100 kilometers. Okay, then I have another accelerometer at D2. At D2, I do this entire calculation and I find out that my epicenter is at a distance of 200 kilometers. Okay, so at D2, I draw a circle of 200 kilometer diameter. Come to D3, I find out the epicenter distance is 250 kilometers. I draw a circle with 250. Now, at least 3 points is always needed. Okay, so the point of intersection of all these 3 circles is here. Okay, so this is where your epicenter of your earthquake is. Understood? So this is how when they report news saying the epicenter was located here, the epicenter was located there, they would have borrowed data from multiple measuring stations that is located all over the country. They would have corroborated all the data and arrived at this common point and said this is where the epicenter is. Okay, you can have more than 3 circles, 10 circles, 12 circles, doesn't matter. The minimum number of circles that is needed is how many? 3. Just remember, it works like triangulation. It works like if your mobile network, the sort of way the signaling happens, there again you need at least 3 towers. So 3 is a fundamental number that way. Just remember this. Okay. Now coming back to the mathematics part of it. One second, it's stuck. Yeah, so what you do is quickly take down these formulas. We'll solve the problem in the next class. Okay, so the top left equation, Vp, that you see is the formula to calculate velocity for a P wave. Okay, where K is what? I've written it actually. So K is your bulk modulus and mu is your shear modulus. In case you guys use G for shear modulus, write it as G, no issues. It will be K plus 4G by 3, the entire thing divided by rho. Okay. Whereas for your shear wave velocity, it is simply the square root of your shear modulus by density. And here one more key thing that you need to write down is for your rho, right? The density should always be in kg per meter cube. Okay, in the question, even if it is given in terms of kilonewton per meter cube, convert to kg per meter cube and then substitute. Otherwise, your dimensionality won't match. Okay, key thing to remember. Next, these bottom 2 formulas you guys should anyways know. Okay, the relation between the different elastic constants. So your bulk modulus is given by Young's modulus divided by 3 into 1 minus 2 nu. And your shear modulus is E divided by 2 into 1 plus 2 mu. Write down these 4 formulas, very, very important. Without these 4 formulas, you will not be able to solve any problem in this unit. Done. Next slide.
Yes, sir.
Still writing? Okay, I'll give you 1 more minute. Write it down quickly. Aita, can we proceed?
Yes, sir.
Okay, next. So this is for the calculation of one ನಿಮಿಷ. Okay, this is for the calculation of the epicentral distance I was talking about. So let's start with the fundamental equation. We know that what velocity is distance traveled by time taken, cross multiply. We get time is distance by velocity. Okay, now keep it aside. Time is equal to distance by velocity. Now, for time of S wave, Ts, okay, is given by distance traveled by velocity of S wave. Similarly, time for P wave is distance traveled by velocity of P wave. Key thing to notice, obviously, since it's caused due to the same earthquake, epicentral distance will be same for both P wave and S wave. So D is constant here. Aita? Next, from looking at our time history graph, we can mathematically find out what is the difference in time interval between arrival of P wave and S wave. So I'll directly get what Tp minus Ts is. Aita? This Ts minus Tp, we know. Now use the formula. Use the formula and take D common outside, cross multiply, take LCM, you get this as the final expression. Okay, note this also down. So the epicentral distance from the point of measurement in any direction is given by Tp minus Ts divided by 1 by Vs minus 1 by Vp. So these 5 formulas you'll need. Done? Understood how we calculated?
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh, and one more thing, this focus is also called the hypocenter sometimes. Okay, hypocenter or the focus are both the same. Next. So this is basically a precursor for that. Okay, more pointally, more seismogram there. At all those 3 points, they've taken the time history data. They found out the difference between arrival of P wave and S wave. They've used the properties of soil at that point, found out epicentral distance, drew a graph like this. Aita? Graph madi, find out the point where the epicenter originates. So this can be done. This is easy. Everyone understood how it is done?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Next, I'll quickly run through a few images. You'll have to tell me what is the reason for what has happened there. Okay. Look at, see, all these buildings are identical. Okay. But some of the buildings are intact. Some of them have collapsed half. Some of them have, I don't know, not collapsed half. What could be the reason for this? Is the building not designed properly?
Oh, I think building only these 3 buildings are having the earthquake, so probably the foundation problem.
Okay, ನಾನು ಇನ್ನೊಂದು hint ಕೊಡ್ತೀನಿ. Even the buildings that have collapsed completely alva, look at them, they're structurally still safe. Andre, building break agilla. Beams have not collapsed, columns have not collapsed, the entire building is intact, but the entire building itself is overturned. Now what could be the reason?
Soil erosion. Soil erosion, sir.
Correct. Soil erosion alla, something called as liquefaction could have happened. Okay. The other possible reasons, maybe the foundation was not designed properly. Okay, whenever an earthquake strikes, and it's not just for earthquake, it is anything where you have to apply laws of engineering mechanics. You need to understand the resisting moment should always be greater than overturning moment. Okay, the minute your overturning moment exceeds, things tend to topple off. Okay, they'll overturn. They will flip and fall. If you take a bench, for example, in a classroom, okay, the bench might have a certain foot area, but adru foot iruttala, the legs of the bench would sort of extend beyond the region of your thing. What do you call these gym equipments, for example? Okay, your equipment might just be on vertical rod, but its legs will be longer in all the directions, because when you're working on it, the resultant of all the forces that is acting on it should pass through that bottom middle one third of that equipment. Ilandre it will topple. Illi that is happened when an earthquake is struck. Okay, because of the self weight of the building, overturning moment it has become more than the resisting moment that it is not passing. The resultant is not passing through the middle one third of that foundation, and hence it has toppled and fallen. ಆಯ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲೇನಾಗಿದೆ
Moment that only at this point.
what has caused this? Which type of wave at least it is?
Surface waves.
Correct. Okay, more specifically love waves. Okay, here again landslides can happen. Okay, here what has happened?
Pillar on this side.
If you look at the bottom, you can see. So here again, what has happened? The structure has been designed well. Okay, your piers are still standing, and your girders are also more or less intact. But what has happened is the soil is moved. Okay, when the soil is moved, maybe the foundation was not designed properly, and the building moved with it. Okay, and if you look at most of the metro construction these days, between the girders, between the piers, the girders are simply placed, as in there is no rigid connection between the girder and the pier. Aita? So when this thing is moved, one side of it is just fallen down. Next, do you guys know what sand boiling is, or liquefaction of soil?
Yes, so when there is no cohesion, the water tends to backslide some liquid form.
So to talk about it from a geotechnology point, a geotechnology point of view. So there's something called as critical hydraulic gradient. Gotta nimge?
Yes, sir.
So your
Yes, sir.
hydraulic gradient at that point when an earthquake strikes would tend to supersede a critical hydraulic gradient, and the entire soil and water tends to behave like one mass. Okay, and the air bubbles that is present within will start to get expelled. So that can happen when an earthquake occurs. Aita? So this is fine. So this again is basically soil below that has gotten liquefied and it is split. You might have seen a lot of videos on Facebook, Instagram, where you see during a flood or an earthquake, embankments collapse. Adella is the reason. Okay, same reason here again. So this is actually collapse of a dam. And normally, actually, this is actual major study. So the actual death due to an earthquake is always very less. Okay, the deaths that happen is due to all these after the earthquake facts. Aita? When an earthquake occurs, you might have things like tsunami or fires like this. Okay, so when an earthquake occurs, earthquake by itself might not kill. Because of the earthquake, the building will collapse and people in the building will die. Okay, or the earthquake may cause fire and people might die due to fire, or it might cause a tsunami and people will die through tsunami. So this is one thing you need to remember. Okay, the death that happens due to an earthquake is always due to after the fact rather than at the point. Okay, so I think we'll stop here. We've covered a lot actually. This calculation part we can do tomorrow. Okay, we'll start with magnitude, intensity, types of magnitude, types of intensity, all that. We'll do tomorrow's class. Next week we can solve problems on distance of epicenter and all that. Aita? So for this subject, what you can do is, if you want textbooks, you can refer Pankaj Agarwal and Manish Srikhande. Okay, so it is a decent book, not very good, but if you want to gain a lot of knowledge and do some extraordinary research, there's a textbook called Bazargnioi and Bereto. Okay, you need to refer that. It is like a Bible. So, and Kramer, and I actually have all these books. what I'll do is I'll probably share the PDF. I can't do it on Google Classroom because we can't share copyrighted stuff there. I'll probably send it on the WhatsApp group. Keep it as a reference in case we end up doing open book exams. You'll need them. Aita? So that's all. I suggest you maintain a separate 100-page or 200-page notebook for the problems, because next unit onwards there are a lot of problems. Okay, for your response spectra and equivalent lateral force. I think most of you all already know how to do, solve all those problems on a software, but you don't, necessarily understand why we are doing what we're doing or how the calculation is done. Okay, so we'll do that. Don't worry. We'll go slowly, especially when we reach that unit. Before that, I wanted to download 1893 2016 version. Okay, and keep it ready. And also 13920. 13920 for your ductile detailing, because there is one unit on ductile detailing. You guys have already studied ductile detailing and advanced RCC, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah. So maybe some part of it I'll ask you guys to present. Okay. The rest of it I'll do, because you guys also use 3920 there.
So it was a presentation only, sir. Sir actually told us to present only.
ಆಯ್ತು, ಅದೇ ಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟೇಷನ್ ಮತ್ತೆ ರೀಸೈಕಲ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಆಯ್ತಾ? Okay, any other doubt with respect to what we did today or with respect to how the subject will happen?